Hello and welcome to On Point, a podcast series of fresh thinking on the big topics for corporates and institutions. I'm James Close, Head of Climate Change at NatWest Group. In this episode of On Point, I'm joined by a broad range of sustainability experts for a closer look at the role that data and technology can play in relation to climate action, and in particular to improve environmental, social and governance risk management. I'm joined by Matthew Higham, who's the Chief Digital Officer and Sustainability Lead for Enterprise at Microsoft, and by Dr. Daniel Klier, who's the President of Arabesque Group and CEO of Arabesque S-Ray. I'm also joined by David Marriage, who's the Disruption and Innovation Leader for Asset and Wealth Management at PwC, and also by Lance Uggla, who's the Founder and CEO of IHS Markit. Daniel, I'm going to come to you next because you've seen this from the financial institution perspective and also the way in which asset managers have started to incorporate this data into their decision making. And you obviously saw the opportunity here and thought about Arabesque and the role that you could play. I mean, how do you see the importance of data and getting good quality data to make decisions?
Financial markets are quite clever beasts, right? Financial markets are able to reallocate capital very effectively and efficiently, but you need to feed it. You need to feed it with good information, good data. We've done that for decades or hundreds of years. We will do it again, but you need to give it good information. If you look at where we are at the moment, I think 2021 I would describe as the year of big commitments. On the 1st of January 2022, we need to start to execute. But if you don't know what you're executing against, we will all struggle. And we all sit on panels all the time and talk about the lack of disclosure, the inconsistency of information, and most importantly, the backward-looking nature of current ESG information. And so for me, there are 5 big use cases, and don't worry, I'll be very quick going through the 5 cases where you need better data. First of all, you need to understand your exposure. Right? If you say you want to be net zero, if you want to say you want to be carbon positive, you better understand, first of all, what's your exposure, what's your baseline. Second, you then need to model alignment, right? If you want to be aligned to net zero by 2050, if you want to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, you need to have some capabilities to model this. Third, you want to manage risks. That's where regulators come in, stress tests, physical risks, transition risks. That needs data. Fourth, which I think is really important, you want to spot new opportunities. Right? This is not just a compliance topic. This is not just a risk topic. This is about picking future winners, picking new opportunities. And then finally, number 5, we all have now huge disclosure requirements, TCFD, SFDR, all the other acronyms that are coming. You need data to address this. For me, those are the 5 big cases why people are now pushing for data. And as I said, 1st of January 2022, we need to move from commitment to execution. Without data, capital will not be priced properly. And I think we will not achieve what we have to achieve.
And I think in those 3 use cases, Daniel, I can see Mark Carney's 3 R's of risk, reporting and returns. And I think, well, you build on that in terms of the exposure and the alignment, that really the transitional piece is really, really relevant. Now, I'll ask each of the panelists to come in terms of what we need to do to facilitate the process of getting access to the data and using it in a really consistent and well-informed way. And I think I'll start with you, Matthew, because we're working together on providing data to our customers. I think in the work that we've done together, we've noted that 80% of customers want to raise their ambition around sustainability, but approximately half of them just don't know how to do it. And starting off with your baseline data is extremely helpful. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about how Microsoft see that and the role that you as an organization play.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so the first one is trust. I think to your point, people are looking at data and don't necessarily have trust in that data. but they can trust the financial institutions like yourselves, and hopefully trust my organizations like Microsoft to work at the global scale that we absolutely need, both at a global and a national scale, to be able to bring data together so they can make informed decisions. We need to be able to partner as well. And when I talk about partnerships, and that's hopefully where our partnership will bear fruit in the future, is that we deepen the relationship and the collaboration and the honesty and trust, again, baked into that partnership, so that people can understand their footprint and make those informed decisions based upon science moving forward. We're moving into an unprecedented world around data at the speed, velocity, veracity, as well as the value of that data. And I think we need to shift our culture around data. At the moment, a lot of organizations for 10 years have been seeing data as the new oil and as an intellectual property. Now it's about what's the exponential value of combining data across organizations, across geo organizations, in order to be able to start to democratize that information out to the masses, so that we can all make the right decisions of the next steps to move forward.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to you next, Lance. IHS Markit's obviously a really leading provider of data and information, and you've really consolidated your approach around all of this and brought some great innovation to the way in which you serve your clients. I mean, how do you see the role that you play to make data available and how people can use it effectively?
Right. Thanks, James. I think, since I founded Markit, we always focused on, the really niche data sets around derivatives, loans, dividends, short interest, things that, were new to use cases in the marketplace. So when I look at, this, huge growth opportunity around decision-making with respect to climate, it really is going to be a multi-decade task for investors, lenders, corporations, and governments to start to establish the playing field to operate in. And so I like to look at and I go, well, how is this data going to be used? And of course, what used to be exhaust, data was exhaust. It's now the fuel for decision making. So I look at the challenges that a bank might have in making a lending decision, or an asset manager in making an investing decision, and then think of the impact that's going to have on a corporation that is also presenting itself with a 2050 net zero plan. And people are going to start using this data decision make around that. That's going to be very, very difficult. And we need to make sure that the marriage of investment, lending, corporate reporting comes together in a way that makes that decision making very effective. So the information companies are going to participate. I think the rating agencies will participate, the accounting firms. I read the other day, I think it was PwC, 100,000 new employees in and around the ESG space. It just tells you of the opportunity to help firms get organized for what's going to be a very, very important time. I think the world, needs to get 50% of the way there by 2030 to get to that net zero or 1.5 degree pathway by 2050. So we've got a lot to do. And, whether you're a bank, asset manager, tech company, or government, we're all going to have to play a part in helping the decision-making, be accurate and correct, and make sure that we don't do more harm with the data than good. And so it's going to be really interesting space to watch develop. And there's lots of work to do.
And thank you, Lance. And I think, you mentioned PwC there, David. I think you've got the perfect title for this kind of conversation around disruption and innovation leader. And I know we've shared some thoughts on some of the ideas you've got. What's your view of the way in which this is going to play out? How is it going to develop from, where we are today to where we'll be by 2030, when we've got the tools that enable us to make some of these decisions to get us to halve the emissions in our portfolio, for example?
I mean, I think, it's an interesting time over the next 10 years, and the sort of transition to the 2030 position is almost as important as where we end up, because actually, as others have mentioned, we could do more harm than good. I think what we're seeing is that actually the difficulty we were having as a market to get the right information, if you like, is because it's a problem we've never seen before. And what I mean by that is that we've essentially got investors who, for time immemorial, have asked for financial return at a particular risk level, and consumers who have asked for a particular quality of product, the lowest price. They've now both shifted quite rapidly to clients still want financial return at a particular risk, but they want to protect the planet and society at the same time. And our consumers want to still get the lowest price for a particular product, a particular quality, but they want to understand the impact of that product. And as a market, to provide that data set back to those individuals who are consumers and investors, we actually haven't got the information at the right level of grain and assurance to answer those questions. So if you think about the financial data, we've got IFRSs, the audits, there's direct sharing with the market on a very democratic basis. Everybody has access to this information in the same way. On the ESG data, which is also becoming price sensitive, we're actually haven't got that same level of granularity and support. There's multiple different metrics coming to the fore, lots of people with lots of different views of the way that data is created. So I think in the end, where we need to get to is consistency of data, comparability of data, transparency, right through the supply chain for both climate change and social impact. We can go there in terms of multiple different routes to come up to a standard in the end over the 10 years, or ideally we'd start as I think Matt mentioned, how do we start to collaborate to really start to shape what that data needs to look like, make sure we're collecting it through the supply chains, involve the sort of current mechanisms that the financial systems use, but extend those to cover some of the non-financial metrics in a way that we can then get consistency and really answer, if you like, the investors' ask of the real impact I'm having, not just of my investment, but the supply chain of that investment, which is very important. And the same sort of answer for the consumer, such that they've got a clear articulation of what is the right purchase given what they care about. So I think it's sort of that journey to 2030 is going to be really important, and making sure that we don't create more complexity than we have to.
Yeah, and just to build on the point around consistency, David, what would be the drivers of that? Because we can gather multiple different sources of data and interpret very different things from them. What would you kind of observe around building greater consistency around data and data sources?
So I think there's a couple of areas. I think one is around the actual underlying data you're collecting and how that's being gathered. So the financial data, there's a huge amount of internal information for the corporates that are being projected out for people to use. We need to sort of look at that in a similar way, if you like, in terms of what is the internal data that, if we shared it consistently globally in an aggregated way, the same way we do financials, would enable us to look through the supply chains of organizations. So I think there's a consistency of data collection, how that's then modeled, and how that's shared through the supply chain in such a way that there's transparency over that. I think there's then a piece around actually conforming on the way that the investors and consumers are conveying their need. At the moment, if you look at things like prospectuses for funds or the definition of a sustainability statement for an organization, there's multi versions of that. There's very nebulous in terms of the market ask. So I think there's a piece around how do we become very clear about the ask that an individual has, or an investor has, or a consumer has, in terms of what they care about. So on planet, it might be around water or climate or land usage or waste. What are the things that we care about, and therefore in aggregate, those are the questions that we're asking the market, and the market knows how to respond because the data we're collecting responds to that more directly. And so I think there's a piece around joining up becoming very clear about what we care about as consumers and investors, but creating a structure for that. And that's where things like potentially COP26 and some of the conversations around that, regulatory alignment, but also starting to work with people like the SSB under the IFRS Foundation when it's kicked off in earnest, to make sure that those sort of conversations around data and collation of information work in lockstep with the standard setters, so we can come to an answer in parallel, as opposed to waiting for the standard setters to opine and then moving into delivery of data, which means that it's probably sort of 5 to 10 years away. Does that help?
Yeah, no, very, very helpful. And I think it sets up nicely, really, to go back to Daniel and Lance as sort of providers of data. I mean, I think what you're saying, David, is that, you know, this consistency needs to be underpinned by transparency, regulatory alignment, and standards. But as data providers, Daniel and Lance, I mean, how do you see it? I mean, how do you think about building that common data set that we can all rely on, but also how we build sort of multiple sources of data and innovation into the way in which we're getting access to data that's going to give us, you know, potentially competitive advantage if it's more reliable and we're able to make better decisions on it. Daniel, I'll go to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, so maybe just picking up on the conversation we just had and your question. First of all, I think we need to be careful not to use lack of data as an excuse, because I think there's actually more data already available than we think. In my old job, we've done our first climate stress tests, and once you really pull everything together that you know about a client, it's quite impressive. In my new role, I see how much data is there out there in the world. If you aggregate it cleverly, if you put it together in a consistent place, if you use external data and internal data, you will see, you know, much more than you think. And I always like sort of where I think the Bank of England is going with their statement, where they say, we don't want the perfect math exam. We want a really good English essay in the first iteration. And I think that's a really good way to think about this. We don't need to land every digit behind the dot. We need to understand how we get 50% carbon reduction done in the next decade. So that's number one. Number two, there are a number of really interesting alternative sources out there. This is probably much more Lance's world, but we all know it's much easier to forecast the growth in the economy. We're looking at the number of containers on a ship from China than to wait for statistics to come out of the National Bureau of Statistics. And there are now so many interesting alternative sources, satellite data and the like, that actually allow us to enrich data that we already have. And last, data alone doesn't get us anywhere. The really important thing is to start to work with that data, because having unlimited sources of data actually is quite irrelevant. You want to model it, you want to work with net zero, you want to work with scenario analysis and actually get closer to the answer. And I'm sure Lance would have more to say about this, but all I want to say is perfection shouldn't be the enemy of progress. And if you go back to my opening statement, 1st of January 2022, we need to see progress. I think we have a lot of the raw ingredients to start to allocate capital.
No, I think that's I mean, it applies so much in climate change, doesn't it? We can't make the best be the enemy of the good, and progress is all important here. And Lance, how do you see it from an IHS Markit perspective? What's your kind of perspective around how we kind of bring this together and think about turning data into information?
Right. Okay. So I like what Daniel said. And I think there's been great progress. You know, companies like Arabesque, Robeco, SAM, Sustainalytics, MSCI. There's a wealth of burgeoning ratings coming that are, you know, at a minimum, they're starting to align people's thoughts around, corporate ratings with respect to E, S, and G. I think the S and G, if I look forward, I think that's going to be a real robotic exercise. It's going to be one that companies report. They may be regulated. Their rating agency can make sure they do it right. The accounting firms can make sure they do it right. They can do it right themselves. But what's going to be really important, if they want to ensure that the data is easily used, long-winded written answers that don't fit into a schema that need to be scored or converted to hard data points. That becomes really, really challenging. And And I do, we've got natural language processing and we can do a whole bunch of things. But I think answers that feed a score for comparison are really important. And I think the S&G is going to come very well. I think that, and it's going to come very well for the 10,000 public companies that are in all the indices and the ones that everybody needs. But there's millions of companies. So then you got all the private companies, and they're in many jurisdictions and many languages all around the world. And that starts to become a more challenging process. And so we're going to need regulation standards, et cetera. The answers are going to need to be hard data that can create a score that can at least order things. I think the harder part is the E, and starting to think forward about emissions and converting, just think of all the subjectivity that might end up in a emissions picture. And I look at all these climate funds and funds that are out there all talking about how many gigatons of carbon they're going to take out of the air. And you'd almost think there wasn't going to be a problem anymore because all these funds are extracting, more than enough. And then you read an article that one Justin Bieber song being downloaded took the same amount of power as 50,000 households. And you really see the enormity of everything we have to deal with. And we're all learning, we're all aligning. The information companies, rating agencies, accounting firms, lenders, asset managers are going to drive the organization of this data into proper decision-making tools. It becomes supply and demand. The lenders are going to need great climate models. They'll start to rally around hundreds of models, which will become a few. They'll have many data inputs. It'll become a few. And the regulators will measure and drive and make performance happen. So I think there's a natural process that's going to occur here. And it's one that, the market dynamics will play out even better when regulators and accounting standards and rating agencies start to play a tougher role, because that drives accuracy. And then the information providers will, obviously deliver the data that works within a commercial model, and they'll add value to it. And then lenders and asset managers will decision make around that, and they'll get their competitive edge by the value add that they put on top of that. So I do think there's a natural process that's starting to happen, and there's been a lot of work done to date, and it's only going to accelerate.
Yeah, and how can we accelerate that convergence? Do you think, Lance? I mean, because that convergence will bring consistency, and I think you've talked about alignment between regulators, accounting standards, data providers, the technology platforms that facilitate it. What would your view of convergence be? And then I'll come to you, Matthew, on that as well, because you'll have a unique view from the Microsoft perspective.
Yeah, so just shortly, I'll just take one little piece of convergence, because there's multiple facets of that question. Just take 80% of the world's goods go across the sea, and there's choices on every ship. If you got 200,000 vessels that you could ship on in the world, each of those is going to have a different carbon footprint. And so if you're measuring your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, part of your net zero target is the footprint that you create. And so you're going to drive change, because you're going to start to choose the most effective vessel, and the most the port that moves the goods around. If the Panama Canal goes to net zero, like they say they're going to do, then your goods are going to be treated well as they go through. So I think companies are going to converge around how they're measured. And these science-based targets are going to require us to be, very focused on emissions and reduction of emissions. And so you're going to be looking at everything. And companies actually are going to trade at premium values for getting this right. And therefore, it'll start to be a competitive edge. It'll come into their pricing and services, and So yeah, supply demand economics once again will prevail. And I think the regulators and the population are going to put enough pressure on companies that we'll have to raise our bar and start delivering into the net zero goals.
Yeah, and Matthew, I mean, Microsoft probably touches more people than most, if not nearly everybody. And you really, in many ways, started the whole digital revolution by making software accessible to businesses and to the individual. Why are you layering on climate data now on top of all of your kind of applications and suites? What is it that's driving you to do this, and how do we benefit from it?
It's an ambition, I think, and that's the kind of pivot, isn't it? It's there'll be a set of organizations and people in this world that will want to go beyond the regulatory compliance and invert themselves back at the market so that they can help everybody else move faster. We feel we are uniquely placed. As you said, we touch pretty much every organization on the planet. We have the global scale, the global compute power. So we're utterly committed to harnessing that capability to be able to drive acceleration beyond net zero, beyond regulatory compliance, and beyond the targets that we're currently setting ourselves. If we didn't do that, could we hold ourselves morally capable? That's the whole point. And it's not necessarily about competitive advantage. It's about doing the right thing whilst at the same time setting an absolute net new standard for what corporate value and economic sustainable growth should look like. It's a difficult one because a lot of organizations just kind of, I speak to a number of boards, even within the UK and across the globe, that still want to either, there's a bucket that still want to creatively account their way out of this. They're the ones that want to meet the regulatory compliance and build standards and meet those standards. And then there is that small group that want to exceed. There's always the people that want to go to Mars. I'd like to think that we're one of them in that sense.
Great. And David, just reflecting on that point really in terms of, the role that accounting standards, accountants are going to play in this. How do you feel about the way in which the world segments, as Matthew has suggested, those who are creatively accounting, those are meeting, and those are exceeding? And what are your thoughts on how to, promote those that are exceeding and sort of nudge forward those that are just complying?
Yeah, and I think there's a point there around standards and consistency and assurance over that to say where people are and how they're sort of, if you like, playing the game. But I do also think that what we're, that sort of connectivity point around and the transparency point, as organizations are encouraged or forced, depending on the sort of regulatory frameworks, to provide that transparency, not just for themselves, in terms of the organization in the UK, but also their supply chains, both in terms of, from a climate perspective, but a social perspective. And that information is provided more transparently to consumers and investors. What we expect to see is a much faster drive of the value shift. So in terms of what are the capital pools these organizations can access in terms of investment, who's buying their products, what happens to footfall if there's a particular issue somewhere in their supply chain that they hadn't factored in. So I think there's increasingly going to be a market drive to drive the right behaviours. So it's not just about the accountants and the decision making of the boards to whether fully comply or take advantage or sort of just play along. I think it will actually become increasingly a necessity to do the right thing, because that's what people, the sort of general population and the market is demanding. And so I think it's making sure that those the right behaviours that we want to see in corporates and the demand from the market are in lockstep and supported by the accountants, but also the regulators. And I think there is a key here about making sure that whilst there is an awful lot of data and there's increasing amount of data and metrics and different views that can be created on the available market information, it's competing in that space is actually can create more confusion. So if you think about if it was the Big Four as an example decided to compete on how to present P&L and balance sheet and how to present IFRS data, and one firm decided not to include costs, and another decided not to include liabilities, for example, on the basis that was the pitch to the market, there is a risk that you then obviously undermine trust more holistically. So I think it's just making sure that as we go forward, we understand what the market needs, making sure there's a consistent flow of information that is comparable and underpinned, with some assurance, and where there are gaps, we call those out, such that it is starting to your point, drive the right behaviours at board levels, but also across the financial services sector.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of On Point. Please subscribe to our channel to get future episodes, and navigate to cinatwest.com for more information on how we're supporting the transition to a net zero future. We also encourage you to follow us on social media to get all of our latest content. Speak to you again soon.